Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video will be on the shadow. And this is a Jungian conception, as in Carl Jung is the originator of the conception of the shadow within the psyche, and what it meant in terms of self-actualization and the individual psychic constitution. So, very briefly, I suppose I should give a description of the Jungian model of the psyche, as one has their persona and one has their ego, one has their self, and then there is the collective unconscious, which all is embedded within. Now, the persona is essentially the portion of the individual that they have cultivated by way of their cultural upbringing and somewhat of an amalgamation between their innate qualities, the ones that they value, and the ones that the external world finds its greatest deal of appreciation for. The persona is an aggregation of these things, and it's really the face that people show when they want someone to like them or when they want to be accepted by the group, essentially, the cultural structure that they're a part of at large. So the persona is largely embedded within the culture and a part of the individual, but mostly something that is construction of the culture and partly the individual. The ego is the private individual, as in the individual, the thing or the aspect of the self that the person identifies with as their individual self. So there is as in the Jungian typology model, I'm sorry, I apologize that my eyes keep diverting. It's not because I'm thinking, but because there's a insect flying around in my room that I really want to kill. But in terms of Jungian typology, the ego would be comprised within the four conscious functions, or the four valued functions. So in my case, that would be introverted thinking, extroverted intuition, introverted sensing, and extroverted feeling. However, as one notices in terms of their ego and their valued functions, the self that they readily identify with, that as one goes down the stratum, essentially, of the hierarchy of the cognitive functions, they become less and less conscious. So, introverted sensing is a function that's fairly conscious in me. However, it's not something, I do not have full access to it in terms of my volition and deciding how I'm going to use it and when I'm going to use it, as I noticed that it propagates in my psyche whenever I'm trying to relax, and whenever I'm trying to console myself and play self-conciliator and assuage any type of trauma or stress really that I have, as I will find that I want to go out in nature and be by myself and walk in the wilderness and establish a routine and get some consistency and things in my life, and tend towards codification and finding the things that I'm familiar with and that I like, and identifying with those things in times of trauma, really. And that's a habitual pattern, not something that I actively try to do. I can get myself out of it by way of indulging extroverted intuition and really just forcing myself to go and be hyper-exploratory when I really don't want to. But I have a tendency and a default to be hyper-exploratory very really as a type. And introverted intuition comes in some respects in this time when I'm in passive states to reveal something to me, to interject a new perspective or position for me to take and a direction for me to embark on. The point of all this is that there is the ego and the person that I identify with, or the self I'm actively thinking that is experiencing the world and that I perceive as my experience, as in the subject. The subject is nested in the ego. My person as the subject, and not my person as the public agent, but the conglomeration of what I know in terms of the public agent and the subject's, the private agent, and my relation to the public agent, or my relation to the culture, or my relation to even my own innate desires per se. That's the ego. Now the self would be the archetypal self, or the highest self, as in the full stratum of the expression of the individual in terms of the constellation of all 8 functions, and this comes by Beebe's model. So I'm mixing classical Jungian typology with Dr. Beebe's work in terms of a way that the audience I'm speaking to can grab this. But the highest self would be the archetypal expression of said type, as the INFP or the INTJ or the ENFP or the ESFJ or the ESTJ, as in that if the individual disappeared in terms of the complex of the ego, as in the ego, it's not completely bad, as a lot of people like to say, as in you need an ego or else you can't process information very really, or you'd be stuck in the world and lost. You can't, the brain doesn't work like that in terms of being egoless. There's no such thing physiologically as being egoless. You would be a vegetable if you're egoless very really. People who are egoless are in comatose states. They're not, or they're on the brinks of death, or they're within the grips of the fight or flight response system. There's no such, anyways, in terms of not to stamp on any Buddhists or anything like that, but it's just to say that there's nodes of organization of the self within the ego in terms of temperament and the culturation and the epigenetic phenomenon that occur to an individual, where the innate qualities are meshed with the cultural qualities, and things such as neuroses and maladaptive tendencies tend to live and get nested in the individual in terms of habitual routines and patterns and things, as in maladaptive conditioning over time. So these things are nested within the ego, but within the highest self, the personality does not disappear, contrary to the way that people like to conceptualize it, but the personality is integrated to all of the expressions of its full range in terms of all 8 functions, if that's a way one wants to think about it, and in its humanness, as in the base anthropomorphic drives and structures that make us up in our totality. It is in the highest self that we're able to commune with the archetypal expressions and patterns that exist in the base regions of the embodied aspects of us. And what I mean in the embodied aspects of us, as in, you can look at the hypothalamus and it's not one thing, and very really the division of anatomical structures in the brain are really for convenience, as in they're called things in terms of geographical convenience, very really, as in we can keep tabs on it by way of its location and things, but it's not to say that it's something that is partitioned and divisioned in any linear one-to-one correspondence and being able to map on function and organ. We don't that the brain ain't like that, as it's a self-organizing system, and it's fairly complex. And the hypothalamus, where a lot of drives and circuits live, is multimodal and fairly multifaceted in its construction as, again, it's an amalgamation of things that is one thing. It's a multitude of things in one, and that's where archetypes, I think, in some respect, get their nesting in us, as in the things that are so old, as in they have been patterns of expression and action, theory, thought, and necessity for survival from the earliest organism onto our evolutionary history, up to us in the evolutionary history, that the salient, relevant modes of being, as in the maternal instinct, the paternal instinct, the predatory instincts, as in the dominating and judicating instincts, as in establishing hierarchy and order. These things will express themselves continually in different motifs and different representations, and most prominently in different personality types and individuals in different situations. And Jung considered these numinous agencies and bodies of organizational patterns of perfect expressions and aggregatory expressions as archetypes, and it's the self that can be plugged up to these things. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all of this is to give one a preview and really a vantage point and the landscape that the psyche lives in, and a way to organize the information and think about this. This is another type of axiomatic system that one could use to think about the world in a way, or think about oneself. And I find it extremely insightful and powerful, especially when coupled with neurophrenology, biology, and cognitive science and neuroscience, and affective neuroscience, and various aspects of behaviorism, as I like. Anyways, in terms of, depth psychology is amazing. That's all in a summary. It is very amazing. Now, to move from that, is to say, in terms of the shadow, as I was saying, that there are fairly unconscious pieces of a person that exist in the they're like, if one wants to conceptualize it and think about it, one could think about it as in, you have the individual, which is a pond that breaks off into a stream, that has a lake that pours into the ocean. And the individuals, the stream between the lake and the pond is the recession of conscious things into unconscious spaces, and the flow of unconscious things into conscious spaces. Now, individuals who, the shadow lives in this intercessionary space, as in, it's the thing among other archetypes, because it is an archetype, as in it's something that is local to the individual, but universal to the construction and the expression of human psyches in their totality. And the shadow lives in this intermediary space, and is really the disavowing of the things that the ego and the conscious mind doesn't prize. For example, in myself, I do not value my desires. This is something I said in another video. So those things, I really don't value my desires, and that's why introverted feeling, or at least that's, I don't know whether the chicken came before the egg, very really, but that's why introverted feeling is in my, at least when I look at it from this lens, I can know in terms of physiology and biology that very really I had my personality before I ever got to make any decisions, but, or at least my temperament, before I ever made any conscious decisions, or ever the world ever acted on me in any way. But very really, introverted feeling is at the very, very bottom of my function. So I do not value my desires. I don't value my own personal feelings, and I rarely know however I feel about something. Like, don't ever ask me what I feel about something. I'm not, so that's exaggeration. You can ask me, but just wait for a very long time, because I'm not going to know for a very long time, and I'm not going to know from any first-hand, immediate way. I'm not going to know in those kind of ways. Also, just unnecessary aggression. I don't like that. Just when people tend to be aggressive just for the sake of it, I don't get that, and I don't like that, and that's extroverted sensing. And it's an aspect of extroverted sensing. It's not necessarily the complete picture of it. As in, there are things that my rational mind values, and there's things that the individual, as I am constituted, values. Though I have done a better job in integrating certain aspects of myself, as in, I did play sports and I did participate in violent actions when I was younger, as in I got into a lot of fights as was necessary, as people were willing to kill me when I was younger, and I had to do things necessarily to keep myself from that end. But very really, I have integrated certain aspects of myself, not really by choice in a lot of ways, but they've been integrated nonetheless in certain ways. But very really, the tendency for me to disavow certain aspects of myself and consider them petty, or consider them worthless, or consider them malevolent even, creates a aspect of myself that is alienated to me, and that I can be that can alienate and unconsciously drive me to ends that I wouldn't pick for myself very really. As in, if one does not get a hold of the things that they dislike about themselves, that they don't prize, and for whatever reason, whether it be from what culture told them, or for example, for me, it was an inverted relationship between what culture told me, because the culture around me at large, in terms of the neighborhood I lived in, wanted me to be aggressive, wanted me to be short-sighted, wanted me to be very impulsive, wanted me to be a lot of things that I was refusing to be. So I disavowed those things, and I disliked them, and I cast them straight into the shadow, as in, this is who I will never be like, and I will not be a thug, I won't be a gangster, I won't be anything like that. And it's to say, though, that there is, thugs and gangsters are human, and there are aspects even to that, and to those elements that constitute those complexes of people that are valuable, that are necessary for the individual to be able to confront themselves and to confront the adverse and contentious aspects of reality, very really, in terms of pain and suffering, in terms of whether you're dealing with nature, other animals, or people. You have to have a edge to you, or if you're completely in the different camp from me and being somewhat of a pacifist, but being overly aggressive, temperance, and things like that. As in, there is a necessary piece in terms of what you don't value, as in, you may not value intellection, you may not value compassion, you may not value what, there's an infinite list per se by way of the person's natural temperament and their rearing as a child and their own personal experiences, but very really a shadow is lurking within somebody. And the shadow is not an evil thing, as in, it is you and a part of you, and it's necessary for you to commune with it, understand it, watch it, and ask for its help, as it is a space of generativity and creativity. And this is something I said in the INTP and purpose video, in terms of extroverted feeling is fairly unconscious in me, but it is the thing, and it's a thing that I don't really like. I'll be honest, in terms of, I don't necessarily like extroverted feeling for various reasons, as in, I don't like the totalitarian structure about it. I am fairly resistant in being integrated and assimilated in any whole and losing my individuality. I do not like losing myself necessarily in that way. As in, I'm not self-preserving, as in, I don't mind dying or anything like that, and I don't mind being uncomfortable. I don't mind accommodating people, but there's something about being at the jurisdiction and the continual influence of something else outside of myself that I am not at all okay with being, I'm not. And I'm working on that in some respects. It's my aversion to religiosity very much. But it's to say this, that when I do commune in that, as in making these videos as an example, I find a well of creativity that swells up in me in new generative aspects. The more I touch the shadow content of myself and try and find a place for it to express itself and make itself known to me, and have an equanimity and peace with it, the more I can be less of a puppet, very really, and more of a human being, as in I'm a person that's differentiated and has their own peculiarities, as in myself, though I have this fear, doesn't disappear but only gets more prominent when I indulge in it. And that's interesting, as that's what the shadow does, as you may find and think that it is the thing that will cause you to die, or the thing that is apart from you. It is you, and will only make you and more like yourself in a very subjective way, in a very objective way, in the same sense as making you closer to the archetype than you would ever realize. Now, very really, that the shadow is not something that is easy to confront, and not something that is necessarily nice, as in no person goes and confronts. So the shadow oftentimes is associated with dragons within the psyche, or monsters that we have created by our laziness and our tendency to be not vigilant, and victims of self, very really, in our pathologies, or the ways that we can be neurotic and pathologize things. So it's like, even in myself, there's wounds and scars, very really, that I have from confronting my shadow, but I am made more self, and I am made more man by doing those things. And there's a ruggedness and an indifference to some things in terms of pain and suffering, as I have experienced greater hells in myself, very really, than I will in experiencing in the rest of in terms of the rest of the world. And it's necessary to integrate this shadow. There's other reasons to integrate the shadow, as if you don't integrate your shadow, you will not hear from your anima. And if you won't hear from your anima, or your animus, if you're a woman, you will not hear from the highest self. And I don't take these things as completely literal, in so far as that there is divine agencies or anything like that, greater spiritual forces at play, but it depends on what one thinks of as the definition for real. And I find that this, though it's like, it's more real than a lot of things are, as in it's something that is the dramatization and the narrative of the human experience, and something that is recapitulated over and over and over again, as in this is something that all will find themselves in, even if they're not aware of it or not. And so I think it's just better to say that you should try and become aware of self, not in the sense of seeking self, but doing as Nietzsche says, and going to the depths. And what you will find is the animality and the distasteful elements of yourself that you're not aware of, and you have a right, you have a obligation to integrate those things and appreciate them and give them licensing to exist, in terms of having compassion and empathy for oneself, in terms of your humanness. Never deny, do not get into the habit of denying your humanness. And I used to tell this to my sister all the time, and one can take it for what it is, but I always tell her whenever I noticed she wasn't being completely honest with herself in terms of her desires, you can lie to other people, but don't lie to yourself. Don't get in the habit of lying to yourself. Pathology, at one point in time, very really, Jung and Freud and other depth psychologists thought that the root of pathology was self-deception. And very really, it's something to be avoided. And you can very really avoid this by confronting the things, or not. Confronting may seem hostile, but by appropriating and approaching those things and making communion with them, and even giving offerings and sacrifices per se to that thing, and trying to give it a space and a voice in your psyche, as depending on what type you are. And I know as my own type, it tends to be the irrational elements of myself, as in the elements that don't have the same logical voice to them, but have the direction and underpinning the underpinning direction in terms of my relational quality with people and my innate desires and drives. It would be cruel of myself to deny myself my humanness. And it's cruel. It's very cruel to deny one's shadow. Do not be cruel to yourself. There's enough things in the world that will do that for you. So this is just some thoughts and ideas on the shadow. And I read Jung at a very early age. And I've been thinking about these things for a while, but they became much more nascent and apparent after reading Beebe's work and literally after some other videos and things. But I thought this may be appropriate time to introduce these ideas. And so that's my video and my thoughts on the shadow. Hopefully you found it interesting, and thank you for watching.